Welcome to our tutorial about cables, plugs, and jacks. You've probably seen a few different types of cables, and you may be wondering what they're called and if you need them. In this tutorial, we'll be talking about exactly that. Cables carry electric signals from one component of your studio to another. They're usually made of one or two insulated wires or conductors surrounded by a shield that reduces hum. Outside the shield, there's a plastic or rubber insulating jacket. On both ends of each cable is a connector. Cables are either balanced or unbalanced. A balanced cable uses two wires to carry the signal and is surrounded by a shield. Each wire has equal impedance to the ground. Impedance is the resistance of a circuit to an alternating current, like an audio signal. An unbalanced line has a single wire surrounded by a shield. The balanced line rejects hum better than unbalanced lines, but if the unbalanced line is less than 10 feet long, this will usually suffice and it's less expensive too. So keep in mind the longer the cable, the more likely it is to introduce noise into your signal. Even if a cable looks like a shielded cable, it might not be one. Except when you're connecting a power amp to a speaker, never use a cable with speaker cable printed on it. These are heavy-duty cables that aren't shielded. Conversely, don't use an instrument cable to connect a power amp to a speaker. It's not built to take strong current, and it could overheat and melt. Now let's talk about connectors. Your equipment will have balanced or unbalanced connector jacks built right into the chassis. Be sure your cable connector plugs match the equipment jacks. Here are some examples of the types of connector plugs and jacks you'll see and need for your studio. An XLR 3-pin connector. This you'll see on microphone cables and inputs. This is a balanced connector. This type of connection is preferred on Pro gear, even for direct lining instruments. The mono 1/4 inch connector. The 1/4 inch plugs are also known as phone plugs because they were actually originally developed for telephone operators. The inputs and outputs of most semi-pro gear use 1/4 inch connectors. If your microphone inputs on your mixer have 1/4 inch jacks, use an XLR cable with an adapter that matches its impedance. This will reduce the hum. You're going to need plenty of these types of cables available and of different lengths. Now let's talk about the stereo TRS connector. TRS stands for tip ring sleeve, describing the parts of the plug itself. You see these on headphone cables. This is the cable you need when you want to split a stereo signal into two separate channels. You'd need a Y adapter, and these often have two standard 1/4 inch jacks and the TRS plug. This is a balanced line. Because of that, you'll also see this type of plug on cables that have an XLR connector. This lets you send a signal from your microphone preamp to your balanced 1/4 inch analog recording input. Now let's talk about a 1/8 inch connector. These are also called mini phone plugs. This is what you use for iPod, etc. They're usually TRS connectors if they deal with a stereo signal. And as you can imagine, it is pretty useful to have some 1/4 to 1/8 inch adapters on hand in your studio. That way you can just line in someone's iPod right into your mix. Here's an RCA connector. These are also called phono or coaxial connectors. They're what you see on stereo and video equipment, and some older semi-pro studio gear. Shielded cables with RCA plugs tend to be less expensive than 1/4 inch cables, and you can buy 1/4 inch jack adapters too. They are usually stereo cables. You can also find an XLR to unbalanced 1/4 inch adapter, but these might audibly affect your signal, so beware of that. In your studio, you'll be using several types of cables. Here's just a few of the more common ones. Microphone cables. Guitar or patch cords. These are usually 1/4 inch cables. MIDI cables. Speaker cables. USB cables. And you might even still be using a FireWire cable. Firewires were how you connected external audio devices before USB sped up with versions 2 and versions 3. So we've talked about mic cables and balanced and unbalanced quarter-inch cables. You will often hear the latter referred to as patch cords or guitar cords. You're going to need a few of these at least. If you need a lot of long mic cables to do your recording, you may want to use what's called a snake rather than running all the cables to your recorder and mixer. A snake is a box with multiple mic connectors, all wired to a thick multi-conductor cable. MIDI cables use a 5-pin cable. They connect a MIDI out jack to a MIDI in jack and vice versa, or a MIDI through jack to a MIDI in jack and vice versa. We'll be talking more about MIDI signals later in this course. Speaker cables connect your power amp to each loudspeaker. Generally, they should be short to avoid wasting power and of thick gauge, 12 to 16, with 12 being the thickest. They usually terminate raw or in banana plugs and spade lugs. If you're using a PA system, it'll probably use quarter-inch cables for the same purpose. USB and Firewire cables connect peripheral devices like your external sound card to your computer. Let's close this tutorial with a couple tips. Number 1, label your cables on the inputs so you know what's coming from where. It'll help you keep organized. Don't let your cables get all tangled up while they're connected to gear. This can cause buzzing and instability if, let's say, your headphone cable is pulling on your sound card's cable. If one of your cables has become defective, make sure you get rid of it right away so you don't lose track of it and accidentally keep using it. Make sure to keep your equipment connections with all your gear powered off when you're not using them. The longer the cable, the more likely there is to be noise. As length increases, cables are usually thicker and made with more shielding to prevent signal loss, that's known as attenuation, and the introduction of unwanted radio frequencies and hum or electromagnetic interference. Also, generally, unbalanced cables are more likely to introduce noise into your signal, so use balanced cables. This concludes our tutorial about cables and connectors. In our next tutorial, we'll be learning about microphones.